It was 17 degrees the night I made the decision that nearly cost me everything. And if I had known who he really was, maybe I would have hesitated, but that's the thing about kindness. It doesn't wait for explanations. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and until that winter, my world had grown very small, just a quiet house on the edge of town, a fixed social security check that barely stretched far enough, and days that passed slower than I cared to admit, especially after my husband passed 3 years ago. I had learned to live simply, to count every dollar, to wear the same coat season after season, and those boots, thick, lined, and worn at the soles, were the one thing standing between me and the biting cold that settled deep into your bones. That evening, the wind cut through the park like it had something personal against anyone still outside, and I remember thinking I should have taken the longer route home. But my legs were tired, and that bench looked like a small mercy. That's when I saw him, a man sitting at the far end, shoulders hunched, hands bare, his breath visible in short, uneven bursts. And there was something about the way he held himself, not just cold but lost, like he didn't quite belong in the situation he was in. I slowed down, telling myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't have much to give even if I wanted to. But then he looked up, and our eyes met for just a second, and in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. Something I couldn't ignore. I sat down beside him without saying a word at first, the cold seeping through the bench, and asked if he was all right, though we both knew the answer. He tried to brush it off, said he'd be fine, that he was just waiting for someone, but his voice didn't match his condition, and I could see the tremble he was trying to hide. I glanced down at my boots, then back at him, and for a brief second, I argued with myself, reminding myself how far I still had to walk, how cold it would feel without them, how foolish it might be to give away the only real protection I had. But then I thought about how it would feel to walk away and pretend I hadn't seen him at all, and that felt worse. So I did the only thing I could live with. I bent down, slowly pulled off my boots, and placed them in front of him. He stared at me like I'd just done something impossible, shaking his head, refusing at first, but I insisted, telling him I'd be fine, even though I wasn't sure that was true. He asked my name, his voice quieter now, almost careful, and I just smiled and told him it didn't matter, because I didn't do it to be remembered. I stood up before he could say anything else, stepping back onto the frozen ground, feeling the cold bite instantly through my socks, sharper than I expected, but I kept walking anyway, each step slower than the last, telling myself I had made the right choice. I didn't look back, not once, because if I had, I might have changed my mind, and I didn't want to be that kind of person. I just walked into the dark, not knowing that somewhere behind me, the man on that bench was watching. Every step I took, memorizing it, as if that single moment meant more to him than I could possibly understand. I remember the sound my steps made on the pavement that night, soft at first, then sharper as the cold crept through the thin fabric of my socks. Each step a quiet reminder of what I had given away, and yet I did not stop, because turning back would have meant admitting doubt, and I could not afford that, not after everything I had already lost. By the time I reached my house, my feet were numb to the point where I could not feel the floor beneath me, and I stood there for a moment in the dark entryway, holding onto the wall, letting the silence settle around me like it always did, steady and familiar, the kind of silence that comes from living alone for too long. I did not turn on the lights right away. I just stood there, listening to the faint hum of the heater struggling against the winter air, and I told myself that this was enough, that I had done something good, something that mattered, even if no one would ever know about it. The next morning, I woke up later than usual, my body heavy, my head slightly clouded, and I moved slower than I liked, making my way to the kitchen to start the same routine I had followed for years: a cup of coffee, 2 slices of toast, and the small radio by the window playing voices that filled the quiet spaces I could not escape. I noticed the absence immediately when I reached for my boots by the door, that empty space where they used to sit, and for a brief second, I felt it. A flicker of regret, not for what I had done, but for how difficult the day ahead might be without them. I wrapped my feet in an extra pair of socks and slipped into an old pair of worn shoes that did little to keep out the cold, and when I stepped outside, the air greeted me with the same sharp bite. Only now I felt all of it, every degree, every gust of wind, every reminder that kindness often asks more from you than you expect. The walk to the grocery store took longer that day, my steps careful and measured, my hands buried deep in my coat pockets. And I kept my eyes forward, not because there was anything to see, but because I did not want to think too much about the choice I had made, not in a way that would make me question it. People passed by me without noticing, just as they always did, moving quickly, focused on their own lives, and I wondered briefly if anyone had ever stopped for them the way I had stopped for that man. If anyone had ever chosen them over comfort, over convenience. By the time I returned home, the cold had settled deep into my bones, and I lowered myself into the chair by the window, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders, staring out at the street as cars passed by, their tires cutting through the thin layer of frost, and I told myself again that I would do it the same way if I had to, that I would not change a single thing, because that is who I was, even if the world did not notice, even if it never gave anything back. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was that somewhere across town, in a place far removed from the quiet life I lived, a decision was being made, one that had my name attached to it, even though I had never given it, one that would soon find its way back to me in a form I never expected. The next 2 days passed in a quiet rhythm that felt almost identical to every other winter day I had lived through. And yet there was something just beneath the surface that I could not quite name, something unsettled, like a thought that refused to fully form. I kept myself busy the only way I knew how, wiping down the same kitchen counters that were already clean, folding and refolding laundry that did not need the attention, and listening to the low murmur of the radio as if it could fill the space where conversation used to live. Every now and then, my mind drifted back to the man on the bench, not in a dramatic way, but in small, quiet flashes, the way his hands had trembled, the way his voice did not quite match the situation he was in, and the way he had looked at me when I insisted he take the boots, as if I had given him something far greater than what they were. I told myself it was nothing, just another moment in a life full of small, forgettable acts, and yet I found myself pausing by the window more often, watching the street longer than usual, as if I were expecting something without knowing what it might be. On the third morning, the sky was a dull gray, the kind that made everything feel heavier, and I had just finished pouring my coffee when I heard a sound that did not belong, a low hum, steady and unfamiliar, coming from just outside my house. I set the cup down slowly and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see, and what I saw made me hesitate, not out of fear, but out of confusion. Parked in front of my small, aging house was a black vehicle, long and polished, the kind you usually only saw in places far removed from where I lived, its surface reflecting the muted winter light, as if it carried its own sense of importance. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it, wondering if someone had the wrong address, because nothing about that car belonged to my world, and nothing about my world had ever called for something like that. The door of the vehicle opened, and a man stepped out, dressed in a dark coat that fit him perfectly, his movements calm and deliberate, and even from a distance, I could tell he was not someone who wasted time. He looked toward my house with a kind of certainty that made my chest tighten slightly, as if he already knew exactly where he was meant to be. I stepped back from the window instinctively, my mind racing through possibilities that did not quite connect, and for a brief second, I considered not answering the door at all, letting whatever this was pass by without involving me. But something deeper than caution held me in place. There was a knock then, firm but not aggressive, the kind that suggested patience rather than urgency, and I found myself walking toward it before I had fully decided to do so. When I opened the door, the cold air slipped inside, carrying with it the faint scent of snow and something else I could not place. And the man standing there met my eyes with a polite, measured expression. He asked my name, not as a question filled with uncertainty, but as if he was confirming something he already knew, and when I answered, he nodded slightly, as though a piece of a larger picture had just fallen into place. He told me someone wanted to see me, someone who had been looking for me for the past few days, and though he did not say why, there was something in his tone that made it clear this was not a request that had been made lightly. I felt a quiet tension settle in my chest, not fear exactly, but the awareness that something I did not understand had already begun to unfold, and somehow, without realizing it, I had become part of it. For a moment, I simply stood there, holding the door open as the cold air curled around my ankles, trying to understand why someone like him would be standing on my doorstep asking for me, as if I were part of something important, and my first instinct was to tell him there must be some mistake, that he had the wrong house, the wrong person, the wrong everything, but the certainty in his posture made those words feel unnecessary. I asked who it was that wanted to see me, keeping my voice steady even though I could feel a quiet unease settling deeper in my chest, and he answered in a way that was both polite and carefully measured, saying only that the person believed I had helped him recently and wished to express his gratitude in person. I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it felt so out of place in the life I had been living, where small acts of kindness usually disappeared without a trace, unnoticed and unreturned. I told him I did not recall helping anyone in a way that would require such formality. But even as I said it, the image of the man on the bench slipped back into my mind, uninvited yet impossible to ignore. And something in the way the man at my door watched me made it clear that he was aware of that connection long before I admitted it to myself. He did not rush me, did not pressure me. He simply waited, hands folded neatly in front of him, as if he understood that whatever decision I made in that moment would not be made lightly. I glanced back into my house, at the quiet rooms that had held my life together in their own simple way, at the worn chair by the window, the small table with its stack of unopened mail, the coat hanging by the door that had seen too many winters, and I felt a strange pull, not toward leaving, but toward understanding, as if this moment was asking something of me that I had not yet fully grasped. I asked how long it would take, how far I would have to go, and he answered that it would not take long, and that transportation had already been arranged, gesturing slightly toward the black vehicle waiting outside, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I hesitated then, not out of fear, but out of habit, the kind that comes from years of living within a narrow routine where nothing unexpected ever demanded your presence, and I realized how easy it would be to say no, to close the door gently and return to the life I understood, leaving this strange interruption behind like something that did not belong to me. But there was something else there too, something quieter but stronger, a sense that whatever waited beyond that car was connected to the choice I had made on that bench, and that ignoring it would feel like turning away from something unfinished. I reached for my coat, pulling it tighter around me, and stepped outside, the cold air meeting me again as if it had been waiting, and as I moved toward the vehicle, I noticed the way the man opened the door for me with a level of care that felt unfamiliar, not exaggerated, not performative, just precise, as if every movement had been considered ahead of time. I sat inside, the warmth wrapping around me almost instantly, and as the door closed and the car began to move, I looked out at the street I had known for years, watching it pass by slowly. And I could not shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind without fully understanding what I was stepping into, only that somehow, the simple act of giving away a pair of boots had set all of this in motion in a way I was only beginning to see. The car moved with a quiet smoothness that felt almost unreal, the kind of motion you only notice because there is no sound to accompany it, and I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, unsure of where to look or what to say, watching the familiar streets fade into parts of the city I rarely visited, places where the buildings stood taller, cleaner, as if they belonged to a different version of the world entirely. The man driving did not speak, and I did not feel the need to fill the silence, because something about this moment felt larger than conversation, like I had stepped into a story that had already begun without me. I kept thinking about that night on the bench, replaying it in small fragments, the way the cold had pressed against my skin, the hesitation that had lasted only a second before I made my choice, and I wondered if that single moment had carried more weight than I had ever realized. After what felt like both a short time and a long one, the car slowed and turned into a wide entrance framed by tall glass panels that reflected the pale winter sky, and I could not help but notice how out of place I felt sitting there, my coat worn, my shoes thin, as if I had been carried into a space that had no memory of people like me. The vehicle came to a stop, and the driver stepped out quickly, opening my door with the same careful precision as before, and I hesitated just for a moment before stepping out, my feet meeting a surface that was warm beneath them. A subtle detail that made me realize how different this place was from the cold sidewalks I had walked only hours before. Inside, The air was steady and calm, the kind of warmth that did not just chase away the cold, but made you forget it had ever been there. And I followed the man through a wide hallway where every detail seemed intentional, every light placed exactly where it needed to be, every surface polished to a quiet shine. We stopped in front of a set of doors that did not look imposing at first glance, but there was something about the way the man paused before opening them that made me understand this was where everything I did not yet know was waiting. He turned to me briefly, his expression unchanged, and said that I could go in whenever I was ready, as if readiness were something I could measure in a moment like this. I stood there, my hand resting lightly against the fabric of my coat, feeling the steady rhythm of my breath, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to wonder not just what I was walking into, but why someone would go to this length for something as simple as a pair of boots given on a cold night. I reached for the door and pushed it open, slowly at first, then fully, and as I stepped inside, I saw him standing there, no longer hunched, no longer hidden beneath layers of cold and uncertainty, but upright, composed, dressed in a way that spoke of a life far removed from the one I had seen, and yet there was no mistaking the eyes, the same eyes that had met mine on that bench, watching me now with a quiet recognition that made everything else fall away. In that instant, I understood that whatever this was, it was not a coincidence, and that the simple act I had tried to forget had followed me here, waiting to be seen for what it truly was. I did not speak at first, because there are moments when words feel too small for what is happening, and this was one of them, standing there in a room that did not belong to my world, looking at a man who somehow existed in two completely different realities at once, the one I had seen on that bench and the one standing before me now. He took a step forward, not rushed, not dramatic, just enough to close the distance in a way that felt intentional, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same tone I remembered, steady, thoughtful, but no longer strained by cold or uncertainty. He said my name, clearly this time, as if he had taken care to learn it properly, and there was something about the way he said it that made me realize I had been expected, that this meeting had been prepared long before I understood it was even possible. I asked him quietly how he knew who I was, because that question had been building in me from the moment the car arrived, and he allowed a small pause before answering, as if choosing his words carefully, explaining that after I left that night, he had made it his priority to find me, not out of obligation, but because what I had done could not be dismissed as something small. He told me that he had not been there by accident, that the situation I had seen was not as simple as it appeared, but that did not change the fact that I had made a choice without knowing anything about him. Without expecting anything in return, I listened, still trying to place the pieces together, and then he said his name, Daniel Hayes, a name I had heard before in passing, on the radio, in conversations I never paid much attention to, always attached to something large, something distant, something that had nothing to do with a woman like me. I felt a quiet shift inside me then, not shock exactly, but a kind of disbelief that settles slowly, like a realization that takes time to reach the surface. I looked at him more closely, noticing details I had missed before, the way he carried himself, the calm certainty in his posture, the absence of hesitation in his movements, and it became clear that the man I had seen on that bench had only been one version of him, a moment stripped of everything he usually stood within. He told me that night had been part of something personal, a time when he needed to step away from everything he controlled, to see what remained when none of it was visible. And what he found instead was something he had not expected, someone who gave without question, without recognition, without even leaving a name behind. I did not know how to respond to that, because I had never thought of what I did in those terms. It had simply been the right thing in that moment. Nothing more, nothing less. He studied me for a second, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that suggested he was trying to understand something deeper than the action itself. And then he said something that stayed with me, that what I had given him that night was not just warmth, but clarity, a reminder of something he had almost forgotten. I stood there, feeling the weight of his words settle slowly, realizing that whatever I had thought that moment meant, it had grown into something far beyond it, something that had followed me here and was now asking me to see it differently, not as a small act lost in the cold, but as something that had changed more than just one night. I remained still for a moment after he finished speaking, not because I did not understand, but because I was trying to fit his words into the shape of my own life, and they did not settle easily. They moved around, searching for meaning in places I had never thought to look before. I told him quietly that I had not done anything extraordinary, that anyone in my position would have done the same, even though a part of me already knew that was not entirely true, because I had walked past people before, just like everyone else does, and so had everyone who passed him that night before I arrived. He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in a way that suggested he had already considered that possibility and set it aside, and he explained that what mattered was not what others might have done, but what I chose to do when it was inconvenient, when it required something from me that I could not easily replace. There was no emphasis in his voice, no attempt to elevate the moment beyond what it was, and that made it feel more real, more grounded, as if he was not trying to repay a gesture, but to respond to something that had affected him in a way he could not ignore. He moved toward a table near the window and picked up a small folder, simple, unmarked, the kind of object that does not reveal its importance until it is opened, and he placed it in front of me with the same careful precision I had noticed in everything he did. I looked at it without reaching for it at first, aware that whatever was inside would shift something again, that this was not just a conversation but a continuation of it in another form. He told me that he had spent the past few days thinking about what the right response would be, not just something generous, but something that reflected the nature of what I had given, something that did not reduce it to a transaction. I felt a quiet resistance rise in me then, not against him, but against the idea that anything needed to be given back at all, because what I had done had not been done for that reason, and I told him as much, my voice steady but firm, that I did not expect anything, and that I would be uncomfortable accepting something that made it feel like a trade. He listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, and when I finished, he nodded in a way that told me he understood exactly what I meant, and that he had expected this response. He said that what he was offering was not a payment, not a reward, but an opportunity, something that would not take away from the meaning of what I had done, but would instead extend it into something that could continue beyond that single moment. I hesitated then, my hand finally resting lightly on the edge of the folder, not opening it yet, just acknowledging its presence, and I realized that this was not just about him or me anymore. It was about what happens when a simple choice is allowed to grow into something larger, something that neither of us had planned but were now standing inside of. I took a breath, steady and slow, and opened the folder, not knowing exactly what I would find, only that whatever it was had been shaped by that cold night, by that bench, and by a decision I had made without ever imagining it would lead me here. I opened the folder slowly, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because I understood that whatever was inside would carry a kind of weight I was not used to holding. And the first thing I noticed was how simple it looked, a few neatly arranged documents, no unnecessary details, just clean pages that seemed to speak more through what they represented than how they appeared. I read the first page carefully, my eyes moving slower than usual as I tried to take in each word. In it, described something I did not expect, not a gift in the usual sense, not a single transaction meant to settle a moment, but something ongoing, something structured to support me in a way that extended far beyond that cold night. It outlined a fully paid home in a quiet neighborhood, not far from where I already lived, modest but secure, a place where I would not have to worry about rent or rising costs or whether the heater would hold through another winter. And for a moment, I simply stared at the page, letting the meaning settle into something real. There was more, a monthly stipend that would cover my expenses without forcing me to count every dollar, access to medical care that would not require me to choose between comfort and necessity, and a line that caught my attention more than anything else, something about a small community initiative that would allow me to help others in situations similar to the one I had witnessed, not as a beneficiary, but as someone who could offer support. I felt something shift inside me then, something quieter than shock, deeper than gratitude, because this was not just about changing my circumstances, it was about changing my role in a way I had never imagined. I looked up at him, my hand still resting on the paper, and I asked him why, not because I did not understand what he had said before, but because I needed to hear it again in this new context, with everything laid out so clearly. He did not hesitate. He said that what I had given him was not measured by the value of the boots, but by the intention behind them, by the fact that I had acted without calculation, and that he wanted to ensure that kind of intention did not remain limited by circumstance. I closed the folder gently, not rejecting it, but holding the moment in place, and I told him that this was too much, that no single act should lead to something like this, because it risked turning something simple into something complicated. He listened, as he had before, and then he said something that settled the uncertainty in a way I had not expected, that this was not about one act, it was about what that act revealed, and what it made possible moving forward. I sat there quietly, feeling the truth of that statement in a way that did not require me to argue with it, and I realized that accepting this did not erase what I had done. It did not change the reason behind it. It simply allowed it to continue in a different form. I looked back down at the folder, at the life it described, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider what it would mean not just to receive something, but to use it, to carry it forward in a way that stayed true to the person I had been on that bench. And in that moment, I understood that this was not an ending, but the beginning of something I had never thought I would be part of. I did not answer him right away, because some decisions deserve more than a quick response. They deserve to be felt fully, to be understood not just in the mind, but in the quiet places where truth settles. And I realized that what stood in front of me was not simply an offer. It was a shift, a chance to step out of the narrow path my life had followed and into something wider, something that carried both possibility and responsibility. I thought about the woman I had been just days before, sitting by that window, counting coins, measuring time in small routines, believing that the best I could do was get through each day without asking for more. And I compared her to the woman standing here now, holding something that could change everything. And I asked myself if accepting it would change who I was, or if it would allow me to become more of who I had always been. I looked at him and told him that I did not want a life that felt distant from the one I understood, that I did not want to be placed somewhere I did not belong. And he nodded, as if that concern had already been considered, and he assured me that nothing in those pages was meant to take me away from myself, only to remove the weight that had been holding me back. I opened the folder again, not to read it, but to feel its presence one more time, and I realized that what I had feared was not the change itself, but the idea of losing the simplicity that had defined me, the quiet way I moved through the world without expectation. I closed it gently and told him that if I accepted this, it would not be as someone who had been rescued, but as someone who intended to carry it forward, to use what had been given not just for comfort, but for purpose, because that was the only way it would make sense to me. His expression softened slightly, not with surprise, but with something closer to respect, and he said that was exactly why he had chosen this path, because he believed I would see it that way. The conversation ended not with a sense of finality, but with a quiet understanding, and when I stepped back outside later, the cold air met me again, familiar but no longer overwhelming, and I stood there for a moment, looking at the sky, thinking about how something as small as a decision made in silence could travel so far, could reach places I had never imagined, and return in a form that asked something new of me. In the days that followed, my life began to change, not all at once, not in a way that erased what had been, but in a steady, deliberate way that allowed me to adjust, to understand, to step into each new part without losing my footing. The house they arranged for me was simple, warm, filled with light, in a way my old place never quite managed. And yet I brought my habits with me, my routines, my way of moving through the day, because those were not things I wanted to leave behind. I found myself thinking often about that bench, about the cold, about the moment where I chose without knowing, and I realized that the value of that choice had never been in what it brought back to me, but in the fact that it had been made freely, without calculation, and that was something no circumstance could take away. Sometimes, I still walk through the park in the evenings, slower now, more aware, and I notice the people I might have overlooked before, the small details that reveal something deeper if you are willing to see them. And I understand now that what happened to me was not about chance, it was about connection, about the way one moment can carry forward into another, shaping something neither side could have planned. And every time I feel the warmth of the boots I wear now, I remember the night I walked away without them. And I know that the most important part of that story was never what I received in return, but the fact that, in that moment, I chose to give.